Have you ever thought about what it really means to be transgender and how this idea has changed over time? If yes, get ready, because today we're going to explore the roots of transgender identity, something that's been around for much longer than you probably realize. The journey of transgender individuals is deeply woven into the fabric of human history, stretching from ancient cultures with flexible gender roles to today's vibrant movements advocating for trans rights. It's a fascinating and intricate story, reflecting our experience's diversity. This video will look into the twists and turns that have shaped our understanding of gender identity. We'll also examine how different societies worldwide have embraced or pushed back against these ideas. There's so much more to this history than you might think, from third gender roles in indigenous cultures to the emergence of the transgender rights movement in the 20th century. All right, let's get started. A transgender person is someone whose gender identity doesn't match the sex they were assigned at birth. Some folks who seek medical help to transition from one sex to another might identify as transsexual. Transgender is a broad term that covers individuals whose gender identity doesn't align with the gender they were assigned at birth. It also encompasses those who identify as non-binary or genderqueer. There are other ways to define transgender that also include individuals who identify as a third gender or view transgender people as fitting into that category of a third gender. Sometimes, the term can also cover cross-dressers, as well as drag kings and drag queens, depending on the context. The term transgender isn't defined the same way by everyone, even among researchers. Transgender identity is different from sexual orientation. Transgender individuals can identify as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual, or any other orientation, and some might choose not to label their sexual orientation at all. Cisgender is the term for people whose gender identity lines up with the sex they were assigned at birth. It's the opposite of transgender. There's a lot of variation in the statistics about how many transgender people there are, mainly because different definitions of being transgender come into play. Some countries, like Canada, gather census data on transgender individuals. Typically, less than 1% of people around the world identify as transgender, with estimates falling between 0.1% and 0.6%. A lot of transgender folks go through gender dysphoria, and some look for medical options like hormone replacement therapy, gender-affirming surgery, or therapy to help them out. Not every transgender person wants these treatments, and some might not be able to get them due to financial or medical issues. Figuring out the exact history of transgender people around the world can be tricky. That's mainly because the way we think about being transgender and gender itself started to take shape only in the mid-20th century. So, when we look at history, it's important to remember that our modern ideas shape how we see things. People mostly understood it from a medical perspective for a long time, primarily until the late 20th century. Historian Jenny Beeman points out that transgender history often gets mixed up with gay history. She uses Billy Tipton as an example, suggesting that scholars have misrepresented him as gay when, in fact, a transgender perspective on his life would make more sense. When there aren't any autobiographical accounts, historians often assign identities to historical figures, which can lead to some inaccuracies. Author Jason Cromwell suggests that if someone who identifies as female expresses that they are a man, alters their body to appear more traditionally male, and lives their life as a man, then they are considered a trans man. This same perspective applies to identifying trans women as well. Jenny Beeman points out the difference between trans people and cross-dressers in history. She notes that someone who only cross-dressed in public was okay with showing their dual life as a cross-dresser. On the other hand, those who cross-dressed regularly, even in private, and wanted to keep their sex a secret, were more likely to be trans. Beeman also highlights non-binary individuals in history. They point out that indigenous societies in the New World had non-binary gender roles that were a part of their culture, which upset European explorers. Back in 1513, Vasco Núñez de Balboa took the lives of 40 natives on the Panama Isthmus because they were seen as sodomites. These individuals were assigned male at birth, but lived out female gender roles. Not everyone in Europe was so quick to judge. A straightforward narrative from 1564 notes that hermaphrodites were actually quite common. Edwin Thompson Denig shared an account in the early 19th century that talks about a neuter gender within the Crow community. Denig remarked, "What a strange country this is, where men wear women's clothes and take on their roles, while women become men and partner with each other." Beeman wraps it up by saying that European writers didn't have the right words or cultural insight to capture what they were seeing. They emphasize that we shouldn't generalize about native practices. The roles of third genders were super diverse, varying from highly respected positions thought to have supernatural powers to those in lower, less respected roles. Before the mid-20th century, people used different terms in Western medical and psychological fields to refer to those identified as transsexual and later transgender, starting around the mid-century. The term transsexual, which comes from the German concept of transsexualismus, introduced in 1923, has gained international recognition. However, many people are now leaning towards using transgender instead of transsexual. The term transgender took on its modern, all-encompassing meaning back in the 1990s. Throughout history, various accounts of transgender individuals, including non-binary and third-gender people, have been found in cultures all around the world. It was really in the 1950s and 1960s that we started to see the modern terms and meanings for transgender, gender, gender identity, and gender role come into play. So, people have different views on classifying historical stories about gender-variant individuals and identities. Some scholars have looked at the galley eunuch priests from classical antiquity and suggested that they might be seen as transgender or part of a third gender category. The roles of trans-feminine Kathoey in Thailand and Hijra in the Indian subcontinent have been around for thousands of years. In Arabia, Kanith has taken on a third gender role, much like the earlier Mukanathun, and this has been recognized since the 7th century AD. In many African societies, traditional roles for transgender women and transgender men have been around for a long time, and some of these roles are still present today. Fluid and third gender roles among North American indigenous peoples, like the Navajo Nadlehi and the Zuni Lahamana, have been around since before colonial times. Some medieval European documents have been looked at as potential accounts of transgender individuals. Colonimus Ben Colonimus expresses his sorrow about being born a man instead of a woman, which has been interpreted as an early reflection of gender dysphoria. John or Eleanor Reichner was a male-bodied Briton who got arrested in 1394 while living and working as a sex worker dressed as a woman. Some modern scholars see this as a case of transgender identity. In Japan, stories about transgender individuals date back to the Edo period. In Indonesia, you'll find millions of trans and third-gender individuals known as waria. And, interestingly, the pre-Islamic Bugis society in Sulawesi acknowledges 5 different gender roles. In 1776, the Public Universal Friend in the United States rejected transgender people's birth names and any gendered pronouns. Accounts from the 19th century document Transgender American Men and Women circle Hermaphroditos, the first known informal transgender advocacy organization in the United States, started in 1895. Back in the early 20th century, there were some pioneering sexual reassignment surgeries happening at a German clinic. They even attempted an ovary and uterus transplant. Unfortunately, that clinic was destroyed during the Third Reich. In the 1950s, the journeys of transgender women, Christine Jorgensen and Coccinelle, opened up conversations about sex reassignment surgery in North America and Europe. The fight for transgender rights in the U.S. started with significant events. There were a few riots against the police, like the Cooper Donuts riot in 1959, the Compton's Cafeteria riot in 1966, and the Stonewall riots that went on for several days in 1969. Back in the 1970s, Lou Sullivan made history as the first openly gay trans man and started the very first organization for transgender men. Meanwhile, some feminists pushed back against ideas of womanhood that included transgender women, leading to what we now call gender-critical feminism. Back in the 1990s and 2000s, the Transgender Day of Remembrance came about in the United States, and we saw transgender politicians stepping into different public offices. In some countries, we've seen legislative and court actions start to acknowledge the rights of transgender individuals, while in others, those rights are still being restricted. Stryker points out that scholars today have two main ways of looking at trans history. Historians look at people from the past and consider them as trans, even if they didn't use that label themselves. Stryker talks about transgender history and uses the term to describe folks who step away from the gender they were assigned at birth. In the same way, trans history expands LGBT history to include more than just same-sex desire or sexuality. I really think it's a mistake to assume that just studying same-sex desire will give us all the insights we need about LGBT history, Baker points out. Stryker highlights that when we study same-sex desire, we tend to think of sex as something fixed. But she argues that trans history reveals how gender expression can challenge the social biases that make us assume everyone in the past was heterosexual unless we find evidence to the contrary. Scholars generally agree that trans history owes a lot to LGBT history. A lot of them got their start with queer theory, which popped up in the early 1990s. They also warn against viewing these fields as being at odds with each other. There are so many exciting possibilities ahead for trans scholarship. Historians need to think about this medical model that suggests transgender expression has to involve some bodily change, like surgery or hormones, you know? Baker is all about urging historians to explore trans history further back in time, mainly before modern medical technology came into play. He mentions that this can help us consider what it was like for people to change their identities without changing their bodies. He emphasizes that the transgender experience isn't only about medical intervention. Even so, since medical discussions have played such a significant role in shaping trans identity, some scholars think we should focus on it more. The work of physicians, psychiatrists, and sociologists who have engaged with trans individuals hasn't received the attention it deserves in academic circles, Snorton points out. Even with all the efforts from cultural theorists and activists focusing on race and gender intersections, many academics point out that there's still a noticeable lack of research on the experiences of trans people of color. You know, the topics we've been discussing have been pretty white, Skidmore mentions. She hopes scholars can dig up more histories of trans people of color. Race points out that the connection between race and trans identities is something he thinks scholars will explore more in the coming years. For a lot of folks, this topic hits close to home, and they dive into it even when they don't always feel at ease in academic spaces, whether they're trans individuals or those exploring trans history. Stryker points out that there are scholars in women's and gender history who feel that trans history devalues what they prioritize. Additionally, some scholars recognize that trans history and trans studies have faced some pushback. The AHA's 2015 LGBTQ Task Force report shares a story from a historian who encountered some pushback from a blind reviewer of a U.S. history journal. The reviewer dismissed their efforts to incorporate trans studies into U.S. history, labeling it a manifesto instead of legitimate scholarship. In another notable situation in 2017, a group of trans scholars urged a boycott of WMSTL, a well-known online discussion group for women's studies, because the moderators didn't step in during conversations that insisted biological reproduction was a key defining trait of womanhood. Right now, as trans people are getting more attention in the media, we're also seeing a lot of hostile laws, harsh political talk, and even violence. Scholars believe that diving into trans history is more important than ever. Baker points out that a lot of folks are talking about trans issues today, and emphasizes that understanding the history is crucial for having a meaningful discussion about regulating trans lives. What drives a lot of the political talk about trans bodies, Skidmore points out, is the notion that they're something new and they're seen as a threat. She adds that trans history holds amazing power because it shows that trans people aren't new. They've been part of our world for a long time. Even with the growing transgender pride movement and a level of awareness about trans individuals like never before in the U.S., trans and non-binary people still face marginalization. In 2021, the Human Rights Campaign estimates that 50 trans and non-binary individuals were tragically murdered. It's alarming that 82% of transgender individuals have thought about suicide. And in a 2022 study, 56% of trans youth said they had tried to take their own lives at some point. According to the National Center for Transgender Equality, over 1 in 4 transgender individuals has faced a bias-driven assault, with even higher rates reported among trans women and people of color. A natural movement for equality and visibility is happening in academia, with historians like Gil Peterson diving into the important work of documenting trans lives. Elders shared trans people's stories, passed down through oral traditions. "We've always been our historians," Gil Peterson shares. It's interesting how those who try to punish or belittle transgender people often end up keeping their stories alive, almost without realizing it. Historians look at various sources like medical literature, court records, and police reports. Even though these sources can be a bit biased, they help us understand how transgender people lived and expressed themselves in the past. As a historian, my biggest challenge isn't really about struggling to find materials. It's actually that there's just so much to write about, Gil Peterson shares. I just don't have enough time in my career. However, historians often need help to apply modern ideas to the past. Do you think historians should use terms like transgender for people who lived before that word was around? So, how should they approach writing about folks who either didn't get the chance to share their pronouns or might not have wanted to come out as gender divergent? In the end, just like there isn't just one way to experience being transgender, there wasn't a single way to be trans back in the day. And honestly, there's no guidebook for diving into transgender history. Gil Peterson points out that these questions show what labels are on people's minds today. She suggests that historians should dig into the numerous stories of individuals who pushed against the binary, allowing their experiences to tell their tales. Gil Peterson points out that both historians and the public need to move away from the belief that trans people are a new thing. Instead, they should focus on uncovering their stories. LGBT history is right there before us, she says. We can't picture the past in our minds,